Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo.
They want the church to try to be part of the whole effort to prevent this nuclear war, don't they? I mean, they have a lot of that idea that the only thing to do with this is prevent it. I mean, once we got started with this, I mean, picking up the pieces is almost unthinkable in a way. And so we've got to bend all of our energy to figuring out how to avoid nuclear warfare from ever happening.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Father Dan Ring, pastor at St. Ignatius Parish in Oregon. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic, the Bishop's Peace Pastoral, Morality and Nuclear Warfare. Here's Father Bacik.
Dan, let's talk a little bit about the Bishop's pastoral letter on peace. That's much in the news. The bishops have recently finished their final draft of that document, and the process now of trying to educate people about it is going on. I think it's important to realize that the document is addressed not just to the Catholic world, but to the general public in the United States. And what the bishops hope to do is to influence the whole debate, to get the moral slant, to make sure that happens. And I say that, I think about the Pentagon Papers and what we learned about the war in Vietnam, where moral considerations at the highest levels were never a part of the discussion at all. Should we be doing this or that from a moral viewpoint? And the bishops want to make sure this moral dimension gets into the whole debate. And so in the first part of their document, they try to set some of the tone for that. They remind us of the just war theory and of the pacifist position in the Catholic tradition. The whole Christian world has operated out of that just war theory very often. And so then in the second part of the document, they get into the moral consideration of the thing. So shall we begin to discuss all of that? You're game for this.
I surely am.
In fact, it's more than that, isn't it? It's important to us.
I think that the overall perspective of the document in terms of trying to bring some hope in the face of almost a debilitating crisis in regard to nuclear arms is something that is almost a gift that anybody that has hope can offer each other. And it's important because a lot of us feel overwhelmed by the threat of the nuclear war, nuclear arms possibility. We lived with it a long time and taken it for granted. But we're saying that it's gotten to the point where something clearly has to be done in a participating democracy, and you and I are a part of that. So we're anxious to find ways to act to make it a safer world.
Right. It has to be a concern of everybody. As a matter of fact, many people have sort of turned off the concern, and it's so threatening and frightening, anxiety-producing, that many people simply have turned it out. We talk about psychic numbness, where people refuse to face it, but we pay the price for that, and people who are refusing to face up to the issue may well be suffering some sort of anxiety because they are not doing so.
The technical aspects of the nuclear arms debate sometimes are overwhelming. You know, it's hard to deal with the concepts, with all the information. When we get into some kind of moral principles, they can be difficult to handle too. But I think that's what we want to do today.
Right, that is important. I think we should remind ourselves again that the bishops have worked at this document for a long time. They've interviewed a lot of people. They've talked to theologians, but they've also talked to military experts and State Department people, people connected with the administration, with the Pope, with the European bishops, and so on, in trying to formulate this. And that the bishops now have really given an overwhelming endorsement to their final draft. I think there's only 9 negative votes among all the bishops, right, and over 200 who support this final document. So let's look now at some of the second part of the document, Dan, where they are talking about the moral considerations, and they really do give us their conclusions about the whole thing. They want the church to try to be part of the whole effort to prevent this nuclear war, don't they? I mean, they have a lot of that idea that that the only thing to do with this is to prevent it. I mean, once we got started with this, I mean, picking up the pieces is almost unthinkable in a way. And so we've got to bend all of our energy to figuring out how to avoid nuclear warfare from ever happening. And they think that it is part of their job to help form public opinion. And they really do want to try to set limits on governmental policy on all of this. They really are interested in saying, hey, there's ways in which we've got to say no. It's one of the reasons I think the document really is a prophetic kind of statement and a difficult one, because they are going against administration policies here in many ways.
There's probably a practical analogy in terms of medicine that to always cure the disease is sometimes a much greater task than to prevent it. So we're moving back in medicine to a more preventative kind of an attitude that was present back in the 20s, but the whole emphasis on a holistic lifestyle, and that's the analogy I think is present here.
No, it's a good one. I like that. And we see that, don't we, in a lot of different fields, this holistic approach and preventing, trying to work to keep our health going, exercise, diet, and so on ahead of time so we don't find so many medical problems. So when they begin to give their moral conclusions now, one of the first things that they say is that they're say a clear no to nuclear weaponry in regards to civilian targets and population centers, and even to military targets that where it would spill over in a way to the civilian targets. So I think that what you see throughout the document is this clear insistence that we've always had in the just war theory that non-combatants cannot be harmed or injured, that it is simply wrong to draw them in somehow. And, of course, in the nuclear age, that is all sharpened, because when we think of the tremendous way that people could be wiped out in just a flash, a few seconds, thousands and thousands of people. And also the fact that most military installations then end up being close enough to civilian targets that to bomb those is going to mean that non-combatants are going to be involved. And so I think really it is part of their mode of arguing on this first moral principle here is the principle of proportionality, that and the whole idea of that you are not allowed to destroy non-combatants in warfare.
The point is that these people, non-combatants, are innocent people. They've not been the ones to precipitate the war. They're as innocent as a child, and there would be children included in those people we call non-combatants.
That whole idea of the targeting civilian populations and so on is brought out in the bishop's statement. I don't really recall right now if it's in that second part, but where they have a letter from William Clark, the administration person, about the U.S. policy on this, and Caspar Weinberger also has a statement in there clearly saying that it is not the U.S. policy, this administration's policy, to target civilian populations, that we definitely are not doing that. And I think later on what they end up saying is that, however, right within the city of Moscow, there's all kinds of military targets that are, I think in my own mind, it's 40 or 60 such targets right within the city of Moscow, meaning that if you drop just one bomb on just one of those military targets, you would do tremendous damage to the whole civilian population of Moscow.
Neither you or I have seen the final draft. I think the bishops have put those quotes in footnotes this time. But the effort to deal, to try to understand where American policy is has been made. And the reservation is still there. The bishops are not at all comfortable with the response made by present American strategies.
Right. So the first clear no to the use of nuclear weapons on civilian population centers, non-combatants, is clear in the bishop's statement. No entirely to that. This cannot be part of our policy in the United States. And, of course, the administration says, well, it isn't. And then you get to the next level of saying, yes, but if you bomb military targets, that is what's going to happen. you're going to end up hitting an awful lot of innocent people, and that is not morally justifiable.
Right.
So we get a sort of conflict right there with administration policy, I think, at that second level of the discussion. Now let's go to another principle that they have enunciated, and that is that initiating of nuclear warfare is also out, even in defense against non-nuclear attacks. So that their idea is that we cannot ever be the ones who make the first nuclear strike. Now
So if there was a conventional attack, you're saying we cannot raise the level of the war to nuclear.
Right. And that the obvious theater where this has application is in Europe, and this has created a lot of conflict with the whole NATO policy because the Soviet and the Warsaw Pact nations have far superior conventional forces in Europe and presumably could overrun Europe if they so decided, and that the obvious policy in place is that to use tactical nuclear weapons to blunt such an attack and make it not possible. But our bishops are saying that really to initiate nuclear warfare at that level is not morally justifiable.
But wouldn't just war theory allow that kind of response?
Well, I think what the mode of arguing, as I understand it, that they're using is that it is impossible to think of escalation. I would say that the just war theory is a way of approaching this. We have to be able to the proportionality theory, you would argue it along those lines, and I think that what the bishops have done out of the just war theory is simply say that the dangers of escalation and the possibility of this tremendous damage done to civilian populations and so on makes that kind of response unacceptable. So I think they are arguing it precisely on the just war theory.
The proportionate good attained from initiating a nuclear war would be overshadowed by the results of that nuclear.
Now, don't you sense in the document that always that great fear of escalation on their part? Because I will get to that in a moment, I suppose, as a next section here. But they do always have that sense that it doesn't appear possible, or at least it's not clearly possible, to limit that kind of nuclear response. That that's going to bring on a nuclear response from the other side, and then it's going to escalate.
We're living in this deterrence climate, and that's precisely the threat. Once used, the war has begun on both sides.
So we've got another clear no to the initiation of nuclear warfare. And, I mean, obviously that says we could never use a first strike against the Soviet Union, and for them to use first strike against us would be morally reprehensible as well, that is simply out. But more probably pragmatically or realistically, it really is flying in the face of NATO policy. And I think that probably a lot of nervousness about the bishop's position comes at this point. I would suspect that the European bishops were most upset about this aspect of the bishop's document, because they're sitting over there in Europe with the threat of the invasion by the Warsaw Pact nations and Soviet tanks rolling across Europe. And I think that probably if there was a place where they wanted to influence the document, my guess is that it's at this point.
I think so, and yet it's not from a desire on the part of European bishops to go against what American bishops are thinking. It's just that they feel the time might not be right quite yet. The German bishops did issue a pastoral letter with the hope that the use of violence could be eliminated, from international and politics. So they're moving in the same direction, but if I live 25 miles from a Russian border, I'd be pretty cautious too.
And it reminds me of one of the statements the bishops made about keeping the nuclear weapons away from the border areas. A very practical kind of comment that they have made about all that. Dan, let me read this one thing. This is the final draft now in which talking about this initiation of nuclear war, and they've really strengthened the statement from the old language of abhorring the initiation of nuclear war as an unjustifiable moral risk. It now reads in the final draft, "We do not perceive any situation in which the deliberate initiation of nuclear warfare, on however restricted a scale, can be morally justified." It further asserted non-nuclear attacks by another state must be resisted by other than nuclear means. So that is the final statement that the bishops have debated carefully. That was introduced by Archbishop John Quinn and received backing from the bishops, I think even maybe as opposed to what the committee had recommended on that particular point. It indicated that in this final draft, as many of the people in the media picked up, usually when the votes came, they strengthened their statements against nuclear war. It always seemed to, when it came down to a vote, the bishops were tilting further and further away from administration policy. I think perhaps this is one of the reasons why people on the left have felt easier in their own conscience in supporting this final draft of the document. But there we have a clear example. We do not perceive any situation in which the deliberate initiation of nuclear warfare, on however restricted a scale, can be morally justified. So you can't fire one nuclear weapon at one tank coming across Europe in their minds.
This is the kind of struggle and thinking that I think really comes out of an effort to live a moral life. It's difficult to make that statement. We're skeptical about, the bishops first said they were skeptical about whether any limited nuclear war could occur, and as they think about it and look at the information, they're saying to the best of our communal decision-making ability, we don't see how it really could be possible. They're now saying, to be human, to be agents that act for good and for life, we don't see that a war is possible even in some limited theater in some corner of the world.
Yes. Perhaps it is maybe a third principle here and we ought to say how they treated it, I think, and that is it possible to think in any way of a limited nuclear war, moving out of Europe where there's a population center now, and you get that strange scene of a lone battleship in the Pacific or aircraft carrier, and whether it would be legitimate to use a nuclear weapon against that particular target. And I think they took up that whole question of, is in any way limited nuclear war possible? And the way I read the document, they keep asking all these questions. Wouldn't it escalate? And how would you control it, and so on? And there's a clear direction of saying they see no way that this limited nuclear war really is possible, but they won't come out and say an absolute no against it. And I think that hurt a lot of the pacifists, or a lot of the people on the left thought they should have been clearer on this. My own reading of it is that they just asked so many qualifying questions and brought up so many kinds of objections, made it so questionable that it really does come down to the general notion that it's just not acceptable, that no scene really makes sense in this use of nuclear weapons. You read it the same way, Dan?
I think the question is trying to pose cases. Most of the cases that are proposed are hypothetical, and they realize that, and they come back to the stance that a limited nuclear war is impossible. It's going to escalate.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I don't know what's really gained so much about that one ship out in the Pacific kind of argument. I suppose it is a way of getting at the question. But even there, they're so leery of the nuclear weapons that they say all but say absolutely no to that.
That's a fairy tale. That's like people I talk to want to marry who think it's simply a private, personal affair and has no communal dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing exists without deep interrelationships with other people, and in this case, governments and war machines.
Right. So they're trying to be realistic on this and not deal with a fantasy world. Now we have to go to the difficult question of deterrence, and they argue this out from many angles and so on. Maybe it's good to get out in the open right away their conclusions on all of this. And as I read their conclusions, it really amounts to this: they will not call for unilateral disarmament right now. They say that here we've got these nuclear weapons. This is a sinful situation. We don't like this situation. We want to get away from it, but they won't call for unilateral disarmament right now, probably because it would be such a destabilizing act. But they say that that it was all right to keep the nuclear arsenal that we have now, and as a deterrence, but as only part of an overall strategy in which we're trying to get rid of nuclear weapons entirely, in which we're trying to reduce this weaponry. So I guess we would call it a very qualified acceptance of the fact that we've got this deterrence and that they are not ready at this point to call for unilateral disarmament. I noticed one of the pacifist bishop, Bishop Hunthausen, I think supported the document finally on this basis of the temporary character of this willingness to accept the nuclear deterrence that we have. In other words, in his mind, I think, well, very soon we'll have to review this again and say, now maybe it's time to get rid of these things. But for now, they are saying temporary okay to this keeping of the nuclear arsenal that we have.
I think many people are puzzled and disconcerted by that if they are anxious to see nuclear weapons eliminated because they feel like we've had them for 40 years, and what's happened thus far. Our history has been that over negotiations and proposals, the nuclear race continues to expand. There is a deep sense of the need to end the arms buildup, and the response on the part of the bishops that for the present time the strategy of deterrence is acceptable is disappointing. But beside that, I think the remark at the very beginning of the program that we're trying to speak to a real situation and to policy involve people, including ourselves as citizens, is important. To make a stand for unilateral disarmament without recognizing that we're perhaps endangering, creating an instability that would destroy us is irresponsible too.
Yes, they're really poised between two kinds of things here, which creates this tremendous paradox, isn't it? That unilateral disarmament could cause a destabilizing situation that just in the minds of at least some people could be the trigger for the actual use of nuclear weaponry or of blackmail on the part of the Soviet Union, which would force a capitulation to their will around the world. And on the other side of it, you've got this idea of having these weapons and their mere possession. The longer we have them, the more they proliferate, the more people who find out about them and can build them, the greater the likelihood that indeed we're going to end up having this nuclear holocaust. It is a paradoxical situation, as one author, Richard McCormick, great moral theologian, said in talking about this. He says, the paradox is this, that the very evil that must be avoided at all costs, which is the Holocaust, the destruction of the world, can only be avoided for the present by maintaining its own possibility, that is, the possibility of destroying the world. And the mind sort of boggles at that kind of thinking. It is indeed paradoxical, but then you're faced with that. There's many people who just feel that the unilateral disarmament would put us subject to blackmail and could be the thing that would trigger some sort of use of nuclear weapons. You know, Michael Novak argues in his paper on this topic that we would have never used the atomic weaponry on Hiroshima and Nagasaki if the Japanese had possessed a nuclear weapon themselves that could be dropped on an American city, that would have deterred us from its use. And I guess that is the kind of line of argument that some people at least are impressed with here.
Okay, that may well have been the truth. The situation's a little different now in the sense that historically, we're 40 years into it, and the arms are proliferated with 6 countries or so, and the potential for some 24. It's a new ballgame. I think Mr. Novak probably needs to think about it in terms of today, not revert necessarily to that analogy when it was just founded.
Mm-hmm.
As you think about deterrence, I think the need to define it and clarify it keeps coming to my mind. The bishop said deterrence means dissuasion of a potential adversary from initiating an attack or conflict, often by the threat of unacceptable retaliatory damage.
Mm-hmm.
Well, a war between the great powers is one thing. Oil in Iran or defending the people of Afghanistan is another. And I find some people talking about deterrence in terms of controlling the political escapades of the USSR.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes some of those escapades are extremely damaging to human beings and a certain nation. But I'm not sure that the bishops are saying deterrence, the threat should be used and pointed at that particular time.
Mm-hmm.
The deterrence seems to me to be talked about in the context of this superpower, global
Yes, I think that's right, and I think that's a good point, yeah. It's not, they don't envision threatening attack on the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons for their invasion of Afghanistan. I think that what they're saying is that the deterrence concept is one that keeps the Soviet Union from using nuclear weapons in generalized warfare.
The strategies then that must be approached if we're going to allow deterrence temporarily are very important. For example, it's at that point that the bishops made a strong statement in regard to this.
Support. I think we're going to have to halt that, Dan. I think that. But why don't you say without the quote? What was it?
It's an affirmation of what is known as the nuclear freeze policy in
right.
this country.
The halt of the deployment of the nuclear weapons. Yeah, I think that to try to pull that together quickly, they are saying that we can't strive for superiority. We're not supposed to be producing offensive weapons. We're not adding to the arsenal or anything. They're just saying that what we've got right now, they're not going to call for us to unilaterally get rid of it, but only as part of an overall policy where we gradually do disarm and come to reduce the danger of the nuclear weaponry.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Father Dan Ring, pastor of St. Ignatius Parish in Oregon. The topic of this week's Reflections was the Bishop's Peace Pastoral, Morality and Nuclear Warfare. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.